The conference chamber hummed with low conversations and the occasional clatter of cups against polished stone tables. There, among the delegates from across the galaxy, Ambassador Alan Cardell felt both out of place and utterly captivated. The alien representatives around him were nothing like the stoic, silver-skinned figures from the old Earth holodramas. Some sported scaled frills that rippled with color when they spoke, others carried the faint scent of exotic flowers, and a few floated inches above the floor, their movements eerily graceful. Alan turned to his assistant, Peter Hayes, a former engineer-turned-diplomatic aide. "They don't look so intimidating," he said in a low voice, gesturing toward the dozen different species gathered at the conference table. Peter, a tall man with a pragmatic streak that showed even in his carefully pressed uniform, chuckled. "Maybe not at first glance, but trust me, Alan. They've been doing this far longer than us. These are old civilizations and we're the new kids in the room. Just keep your answers sharp, don't overpromise, and you'll do fine." Alan leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of his translator earpiece smoothing out the alien voices into English. "And here I thought you were just here to carry my briefcase," he said with a smirk. "Someone's got to keep you from embarrassing humanity," Peter shot back, but the teasing tone betrayed his genuine trust in Alan's capabilities. The discussion at the table shifted from trade routes to cultural exchanges. A vibrant alien, her skin a deep shade of violet and adorned with faintly glowing patterns, stood and addressed the group. Her voice resonated in harmonic layers, but Alan's translator rendered it clear. "As Princess Zyra of the Shaldar Dominion, I extend greetings and the hope that today we might deepen our understanding of one another." Alan raised a brow. "That's her? The one everyone's been whispering about?" he asked Peter. Peter nodded. "She's a big deal. Next in line to one of the most influential seats in the sector. From what I've heard, she's sharp, too, knows how to sway a room." As the princess continued to speak, Alan found himself drawn to the way she carried herself. It wasn't just her striking appearance or the intricate garments that shimmered faintly as she moved. It was her poise, her calm confidence. When her gaze swept the room and briefly met his, Alan couldn't shake the feeling that she lingered on him just a moment longer than she needed to. Once the speeches concluded, the delegates were encouraged to mingle. Alan took a deep breath and glanced at Peter. "So, what's the game plan? Do I just wander over and introduce myself?" "Think of it as networking," Peter said. "Start casual. Make an impression. If she's interested in humanity, she'll let you know." Alan moved cautiously through the crowd, nodding to a few representatives as he passed. When he reached the princess, she was engaged in a conversation with a tall alien whose armor gleamed like polished obsidian. The two were speaking in hushed tones. But when Zyra noticed Alan, she offered a slight nod, acknowledging his presence. The armored figure stiffened, but Zyra waved him away gently. "Ambassador Cardell, is it?" she said, her voice as smooth as it was layered. "You've come a long way for this summit. How are you finding the Dominion so far?" "Surprising in the best way," Alan replied. "I didn't know what to expect, but the hospitality has been overwhelming, really." Peter, who had shadowed Alan closely, cleared his throat. "And, of course, we're honored to be here. It's a rare opportunity to meet leaders from so many civilizations." Zyra's lips curved in a subtle smile. "You're polite, and yet there's something refreshingly unguarded about your manner. Perhaps that's a hallmark of your species." Alan shrugged. "We're still figuring out our place in the galaxy. I suppose it's a mix of curiosity and trying not to make a bad first impression." "You're doing better than some I've met," she said with a hint of mischief. "Still, I imagine it must be strange to find yourselves in a room with beings you once thought belonged only in fiction." "It's humbling," Alan admitted, "but it's also an incredible chance to learn. From what I can tell, your people have a deep appreciation for art. The patterns on your garments, do they have meaning?" Zyra glanced down at the glowing lines on her robes. "They tell a story. Each thread is encoded with the history of my house, the alliances we've made, the struggles we've overcome. When we weave new garments, we carry those memories with us." Peter tilted his head. "That's a beautiful tradition. On Earth, we have symbols and crests, but they don't quite have the same living connection to the past." "It's part of who we are," Zyra said. Her gaze lingered on Alan. "But it's not so different from how your species values storytelling. I've read that humans have a talent for capturing history in song, in literature. I'd like to hear some of those stories." Alan smiled. Maybe I can find some time to share a few. Do you have a favorite genre? Surprise me, she replied. Her tone was light, but her expression suggested she genuinely looked forward to hearing more. As the conversation deepened, Peter noticed the armored figure from earlier watching them from across the room. He leaned close to Alan and whispered, "Heads up, looks like her fiancé isn't too thrilled about her talking to us." "Noted," Alan murmured. "But we're just talking." "Sure," Peter said, though he seemed unconvinced. Zyra must have sensed the shift in mood. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at Alan. "It's been a pleasure, Ambassador, but I must attend to some other matters. Perhaps we'll speak again soon." "I'd like that," Alan said. Peter gave a polite nod as Zyra walked away, her luminous robe trailing behind her. Once she was out of earshot, Peter clapped Alan on the shoulder. "Well, that went better than I expected. Thanks for the vote of confidence," Alan replied. He watched Zyra disappear into the crowd. "She's something, isn't she?" "Sure is. Just don't forget why we're here," Peter said. "There's a lot more at stake than charming the princess." Alan nodded, though his mind remained on Zyra and the possibilities that lay ahead. Chapter 2. A Fateful Encounter. The next day, Alan and Peter received an invitation they hadn't expected. A guided tour of the Shaldar capital city. It was clear from the intricate patterns on the invitation seal that it was no ordinary sightseeing trip. Zyra herself had requested their company. As their transport descended into the heart of the city, Peter peered out the window. "It's not what I imagined," he muttered. Alan followed his gaze. The skyline was a blend of impossibly tall crystalline towers and low, domed structures with living surfaces that seemed to breathe. Alien citizens moved gracefully along elevated walkways, their forms a rainbow of shapes and colors. The whole place pulsed with life and a certain otherworldly beauty. "It's incredible," Alan said. "Makes Earth's skyscrapers look practical." The transport landed in a square that hummed with activity. Zyra was already waiting, her garments shimmering softly in the late afternoon light. Alan and Peter stepped off the transport, greeted by a faintly floral breeze. Zyra smiled, but her posture remained regal. "Ambassadors, I trust you find our city intriguing." "It's stunning," Alan said honestly. "We're honored by the invitation." Peter nodded, keeping his expression polite but curious. "We're eager to see more." Zyra gestured for them to follow, leading them into the heart of the district. Vendors displayed wares that glowed faintly or emitted melodic chimes, while performers on floating platforms drew small crowds with their mesmerizing dances. Zyra glanced back at Alan and Peter. "We believe art and trade are intertwined. Many of our goods are both functional and beautiful. This market is a microcosm of our culture." Alan leaned toward Peter and whispered, "A little different from the diplomatic dinners, huh?" Peter smirked. "Definitely beats sitting around a conference table." They paused at a stall where an elderly Shaldar artisan worked on what appeared to be a glowing tapestry. With precise, elegant movements, the artisan wove threads of light into a shimmering image that shifted subtly as it caught the air. Alan watched, mesmerized. "Is it alive?" "Not quite," Zyra said, smiling at his reaction. "The threads are infused with a form of energy that responds to nearby movements. Each piece is unique and constantly evolving." Peter crossed his arms, studying the piece. "What happens if it gets damaged?" Zyra tilted her head, considering the question. "We repair it, of course, but each repair leaves a mark, adding to its story. Much like your human concept of kintsugi, I believe." Alan nodded. "It's a way of celebrating imperfections, showing that something can be more beautiful for having been broken." The artisan glanced up, meeting Alan's eyes. "You understand," he said in accented but clear English. "A rare quality." "Thank you," Alan said, genuinely humbled. "It's an incredible craft." Zyra moved on, guiding them to a gallery where holographic sculptures floated mid-air, their shapes shifting with each step the visitors took. As they wandered through the exhibits, she continued explaining their cultural philosophies, often pausing to ask about Earth's traditions. Alan found himself opening up more than he expected, describing human history, art, and even Earth's flawed yet vibrant attempts at building societies. Peter added his own insights, often with a touch of dry humor that made Zyra laugh. "You two have a rare dynamic," Zyra observed at one point. "It's not common to see such camaraderie among diplomats." "Peter's not just my aide," Alan said with a grin. "He's an old friend. We worked together before I joined the diplomatic corps." "Worked together doing what?" Zyra asked, genuinely curious. Peter spoke up. "We were both engineers for a while. Spent more time fixing communication satellites than talking to anyone." Zyra raised an elegant eyebrow. "And now you represent your planet in interstellar negotiations. That's quite a leap." "It's all about adaptation," Peter said. "You'd be surprised how similar troubleshooting a satellite and navigating diplomacy can be. You look for the source of the problem, make adjustments, and try not to cause more damage." Zyra laughed lightly. "A surprisingly apt comparison. I must say, your perspective is refreshing." Their conversation continued as they moved through the gallery and into a vast public garden. The air grew quieter here, the vibrant city sounds fading into a serene backdrop of chirping alien birds and the soft rustle of translucent leaves. Zyra stopped by a low, flowering shrub with blooms that emitted faint, musical notes when touched. "This is one of my favorite places," she said. "Few visit it, but it reminds me that even in the midst of all our advancements, there is simplicity and beauty to be found." Alan knelt to examine one of the flowers, carefully brushing a fingertip against a petal. The delicate note it produced hung in the air for a moment before fading. "It's amazing," he said quietly. "Your people seem to find art in everything." "We try," Zyra replied, her gaze distant for a moment. "Though not all of us appreciate it. Some see it as unnecessary, a distraction from more practical concerns. But I've always believed that art and beauty have a purpose." Peter leaned against a nearby tree. "They keep us human. Or, Shaldar, I guess. Art's not just about decoration. It's a reminder of who we are." Alan glanced up at him. "Wow. That's unusually poetic for you." Peter shrugged. "Even I have my moments." Zyra smiled again. "Perhaps that is why I invited you both here. You remind me that there's value in new perspectives. Sometimes we need others to show us what we might overlook in ourselves." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the city, the three of them lingered in the garden, talking and laughing. Alan couldn't help but notice the way Zyra's demeanor softened when she looked at him, as if she felt at ease in his company. It wasn't just diplomacy anymore. There was something more personal forming, though neither said it out loud. Not yet. Chapter 3: Bonds of Curiosity. The Shaldar capital never ceased to amaze. Alan and Peter found themselves spending the following days immersed in its daily rhythms, exploring corners of the city that hadn't been part of the official tour. They wanted to understand more about the culture, the people, and the intricate dynamics that made this alien world so unique. Zyra, surprisingly, joined them on more than one occasion, even when protocol didn't require her to. The three were now seated at a low, circular table in a bustling tea-house tucked into the base of a spire. The room was alive with conversation, the rhythmic hum of alien voices blending with the gentle clinking of delicate glass vessels. Translucent curtains shifted with the breeze, letting in dappled light that danced across their table. Alan sipped a cup of what could only be described as glowing liquid. Tasted faintly of mint and something sweeter, like ripe berries. "You weren't kidding," he said, looking at Zyra. "This is better than anything I've had back home." "I knew you'd enjoy it," she replied, her tone light. "It's brewed from a plant that grows only in our southern provinces. Traditionally, it's shared during moments of reflection or when discussing matters of importance. A fitting choice, I thought, since you're here to learn about our people." Peter, ever the pragmatist, raised a brow. "What's in it exactly? Any side effects we should know about?" Zyra smiled faintly. "Nothing that would harm you. It's merely a mild stimulant, one that sharpens the senses. Though it may be best to avoid drinking more than 3 cups in a sitting." Alan smirked. Good to know. I'll keep it under 3. Zyra's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she continued. You've been exploring our city, meeting our citizens. What are your impressions so far? Honestly, Alan said, leaning forward, it's fascinating. Your people have a way of weaving practicality and beauty into everything. Even the small details like the designs on door frames or the patterns in your textiles seem to have meaning. It's like every part of your world tells a story. Peter nodded, though he kept his comments more measured. It's definitely different from Earth. Back home, efficiency usually takes precedence over artistry. Sometimes the two mix, but not on this level. Zyra tilted her head slightly, considering their words. Perhaps it's because we see no distinction between the two. Functionality is enhanced by beauty, and beauty becomes meaningful when it serves a purpose. That philosophy is ingrained in our culture. Alan set down his cup. It must take a lot of care and thought. I can't imagine that's always easy, especially when you have so many different species and cultures interacting in one place. Indeed, Zyra said softly. It's a delicate balance. We're not without our challenges, but we believe that mutual understanding can bridge even the widest gaps. And that is why I've been so interested in learning about your world, your people. I see parallels, differences, yes, but also parallels. Peter crossed his arms. So, what do you find most surprising about us humans? The fact that we're still getting used to this interstellar community, or that we managed to find our way here at all? Zyra laughed, a sound like a ripple of wind chimes. A bit of both. But mostly, I'm surprised by your creativity. You've accomplished much in a short span of time. Your storytelling, your adaptability, and your ability to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. That's what sets you apart. Alan exchanged a glance with Peter, who gave a slight shrug as if to say, she's got a point. They finished their tea and left the shop to stroll along a wide avenue lined with crystalline trees. The leaves shimmered in the fading sunlight, casting colorful patterns on the ground. Zyra walked between Alan and Peter, gesturing to various landmarks and explaining their histories. At one point, Alan paused before a massive mural etched into the side of a building. The image shifted as he moved, depicting scenes from the city's past and present. How does it do that? He asked, captivated. The materials are responsive to light and shadow, Zyra explained. Each movement changes the composition. It's a way of showing that our history is not static but constantly evolving. Peter leaned in. Sounds expensive. It is, Zyra admitted, but it's an investment in our identity. Such works remind us of who we are and who we wish to become. Alan couldn't help but admire her passion. He gestured toward another part of the city, a gleaming spire that pierced the sky. And what about that? What's the story behind it? Zyra smiled. That's the Hall of Artisans. It's where many of our creators learn their craft and share their work with the public. Perhaps tomorrow I could show you inside. Peter stepped forward, his practical side kicking in. Would we need clearance for that? No, Zyra said. I'll arrange it. You're my guests, after all. Alan chuckled. I think we'll take you up on that offer. This city has more layers than I ever imagined. As the sun dipped lower, they found themselves by a small park with flowing streams and hovering orbs of light that gently followed the paths. Zyra paused, gazing at the scene. I'm glad you've taken the time to see beyond the surface. Alan and Peter stood beside her, taking in the tranquil beauty of the moment. We're glad you've taken the time to show us, Alan said. Zyra looked at him, her expression warm. I believe there's much we can learn from one another. And perhaps, if we continue to share these experiences, we might uncover something truly unique. Chapter 4. A Dangerous Secret. Alan leaned against the sleek metal railing of the Shaldar Embassy's outer balcony, gazing out at the mesmerizing cityscape. The towering structures and drifting lights still felt like something out of a dream. Despite everything he had experienced so far, a persistent sense of unease now clung to him. Peter joined him a moment later, holding 2 cups of that faintly glowing tea they'd come to enjoy. You're worried? Peter said flatly, handing Alan a cup. Alan nodded. his gaze not moving from the shimmering skyline. Yeah, it's getting harder to justify the time we're spending with her. It's not just casual conversation anymore. Peter sipped his tea, his usual pragmatism firmly in place. You're right. People are starting to talk. That warrior of hers, what's his name? Zarion? He's been watching us like a hawk. Zarion, Alan repeated, as if the name itself was a weight. He knows something's up. I can see it in the way he looks at me. Peter chuckled darkly. I'm surprised he hasn't tried to break you in half yet. Not helping, Alan muttered. Peter leaned on the railing, letting the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. Look, I know you've got this connection with Zyra. It's clear to anyone who sees you two together. But you're playing with fire, Alan. This isn't just some office romance back on Earth. She's royalty. If anyone finds out. I know. Alan exhaled heavily. But I can't just turn it off. There's something about her curios. But I'm not sure I can walk away either. Then you better figure it out fast. Peter's voice was low but firm. If Zarion decides you're a threat, he'll take action. And it won't just be your career on the line. It'll be humanity's reputation with the Shaldar. Alan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the faint glow of the city, weighing his choices. The rational part of him knew Peter was right. This was a dangerous path. But the rest of him couldn't shake the memory of Zyra's laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her people's art and history. He felt drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. Peter finished his tea and set the empty cup on the railing. If you're going to keep meeting her, you need to be careful. Maybe keep it strictly professional from now on. Make it look like you're just exchanging cultural knowledge, nothing more. Alan turned to him, a flicker of hope in his expression. You think that would work? Peter shrugged. It might buy you some time. But it's a gamble. Just be ready for the fallout if things go south. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled their attention. Alan straightened as Zyra appeared at the entrance to the balcony. She looked as composed as ever, but her expression softened when she saw him. Ambassador, Peter, she greeted, her melodic voice cutting through the tense air. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Alan said quickly, standing a little taller. We were just discussing our next steps in the cultural exchange program. Zyra's lips curved into a slight smile. I'm glad to hear that. I have some ideas I'd like to share if you have a moment. Peter shot Alan a pointed look before excusing himself. I'll leave you to it. I'll be inside if you need me. As Peter walked away, Zyra stepped closer, her gaze steady. I noticed Zarion watching us earlier, she said quietly. He's not subtle. Alan's heart skipped a beat. He hasn't confronted me yet, but it feels like he's waiting for the right moment. Zyra hesitated, her calm demeanor wavering just slightly. He won't act without cause. But we must be careful. He's bound by tradition, but if he feels I'm straying too far, he may take matters into his own hands. What can we do? Alan asked, keeping his voice low. For now, we continue as we have, Zyra said. But we must be discreet. There's so much I still wish to learn about your people, your perspective. I can't let his suspicions prevent me from understanding what makes humanity unique. Alan nodded slowly. I understand. I'll be careful. She touched his arm lightly, just for a moment, and her expression softened. Thank you, Alan. I know this is difficult for both of us, but I believe it's worth the effort. Her hand fell away and the weight of her touch lingered even after she turned and walked back inside. Alan stood there, his thoughts swirling. He knew Peter was right, this was dangerous territory. But as he watched Zyra's retreating figure, he couldn't shake the feeling that some risks were worth taking. Chapter 5. A Shared Moment. Alan and Peter walked through the market district as the twin moons cast their pale light over the bustling city. The day's discussions at the embassy had dragged on longer than expected, leaving both men eager to decompress. Though Alan would never admit it, the long hours of diplomacy had begun to take their toll. He glanced at Peter, who seemed as unbothered as ever. The guy could spend all day in negotiations and still look ready for a hike. Not too late for one last stop, is it? Alan asked, trying to gauge his friend's mood. Peter smirked. You're the ambassador. If you're up for it, I'm up for it. Alan led them down a side street lined with glowing lanterns and quiet cafes. They hadn't planned on running into anyone, let alone the princess herself. But there she was. Zyra stood near a small shop, her elegant robes dimly illuminated by the flickering light of the lanterns above. She appeared lost in thought, Her usually composed expression softened into something almost contemplative. Alan hesitated. What's she doing out here? Peter squinted at the princess. Looks like she wanted a break too. Guess even royalty needs some downtime. Before Alan could decide whether to approach, Zyra turned and noticed them. Her face brightened when she saw Alan, and she raised a hand in greeting. Ambassador Cardell, Peter. What a surprise. Alan walked over, Peter close behind. Princess Zyra, we weren't expecting to see you here. Long day at the embassy. Zyra gave a faint, rueful smile. It never truly ends. Sometimes it helps to step away for a while. I find this part of the city more grounding. It reminds me of simpler times. Peter chuckled. Sounds like a universal truth. Doesn't matter what planet you're on. Everyone needs a breather from work. Exactly, Zyra agreed. And you? Are you enjoying your exploration of the city? Alan nodded. Every time we think we've seen it all, we find something new. Your people's craftsmanship, the little details in everything. It's fascinating. I'm glad you think so, Zyra said. I've always believed that the heart of any civilization is found not in its palaces or halls of power, but in the places where people live and create. That's why I come here. Alan noticed her gaze drift to a nearby booth where an artist was carving intricate patterns into a translucent sheet of material. The work shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting the soft blues and purples of the sky. I can see why, he said. There's something peaceful about it. Zyra tilted her head, studying him. Do you find it difficult, being so far from home? From everything familiar? Alan considered her question. It's an adjustment, he admitted, but I've always believed that understanding others, truly understanding them, means stepping outside your comfort zone. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't willing to do that. Peter chimed in. He's got a point. It's not easy, but that's why we signed up for this, right? To bridge those gaps. Zyra looked thoughtful. Perhaps that's why I've enjoyed speaking with you both. You remind me that the distance between our worlds isn't as great as it seems. For a moment, none of them spoke. The artist at the booth finished his piece, holding it up to inspect it in the light. The delicate lines seemed to tell a story, one that no words could fully capture. Alan glanced at Zyra, who was also watching the artist, her expression soft and introspective. Do you ever feel like you carry the weight of your whole people on your shoulders? Alan asked gently. Zyra's lips parted slightly, as if the question had caught her off guard. She met his gaze and then nodded. Every day. I was born into this role, and sometimes it feels as though my own identity is secondary to what I represent. But moments like this, she gestured to the scene around them, they remind me that my people are more than their expectations of me. They're individuals, creators, dreamers. That's what I try to hold on to. Peter crossed his arms. That's a lot of pressure. Guess it's a good thing you can sneak off to places like this. Zyra smiled faintly. It helps. And, of course, good company makes it easier. Alan felt his chest tighten slightly at her words. Her tone wasn't flippant or rehearsed. It carried a genuine warmth that made him want to stay in that moment a little longer. He nodded toward a quieter spot near the market's edge. Maybe we can sit down for a while. Talk more. Away from the crowd. Zyra hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they weren't drawing too much attention. Then she gave a small, almost shy nod. Yes, I'd like that. The three of them found a quiet corner where a soft fountain trickled under the light of the moons. They sat and talked about their worlds, about Earth's bustling cities, the Shaldar's vast cultural heritage, and the small joys that connected them all. It was a rare, unguarded conversation, one that Alan suspected neither he nor Zyra would soon forget. Chapter 6. The Fragile Balance. Alan stood at the edge of a crystalline bridge, watching the reflection of the Shaldar moons ripple on the waters below. The cool night air helped calm his thoughts, but only slightly. He had come to the capital as a representative of Earth, tasked with building ties, fostering trust, and ensuring humanity's place among the stars. Yet here he was, tangled in a personal connection that no diplomatic manual had prepared him for. Peter's footsteps echoed lightly on the bridge as he approached. You look like you're about to jump, he said, leaning casually against the railing. Alan sighed. Not quite, but it feels like I'm walking a tightrope. On one hand, I'm supposed to be the picture of diplomacy. On the other hand, there's Zyra. Peter smirked. You can't exactly blame her for being charming. She's more than that, Alan said quietly. She's different. I can't explain it. Peter nodded. I get it. She's smart, she's curious, and she's probably the only alien who doesn't look at us like we're toddlers playing with starships. But Alan, you have to remember why you're here. This isn't just about you. I know that, Alan said, rubbing the back of his neck. But it's not as simple as walking away. Every time I think I should put some distance between us, she looks at me like she actually cares what I have to say. Like what we're doing here matters. It does matter, Peter agreed. But you need to figure out if it matters more than your career, because if this blows up, that's what you'll lose. You and I both know Zerion's just waiting for a reason. Alan turned to look at him. You think he'd make a move? Officially, Peter shrugged. If he thinks it's necessary to protect her image or the alliance, yeah. He's not just a jealous fiancé. He's got a role to play, same as you. Alan stared at the moons, their pale light casting long shadows across the water. So what do you think I should do? Be smart about it, Peter said. You don't have to cut her off completely, but keep things professional. Keep it low-key. The more you make it look like you're just here to learn, to exchange ideas, the less anyone will have to question. Alan considered his friend's advice. Peter wasn't one to sugarcoat things, and that bluntness was exactly what he needed right now. You're right, he said finally. I'll keep it professional. At least until I know for sure how she feels. Peter gave him a pat on the back. Good call. Now come on, we've got a briefing tomorrow. Better not look like you've been brooding all night. The next day, Alan found himself seated in one of the grand conference chambers, the kind with vaulted ceilings that seemed to echo every word spoken. Zyra was across the table, her posture as graceful as ever. Zerion was nearby, his dark armor reflecting the light from the glowing fixtures above. The discussion turned to cultural exchanges, and Alan carefully framed his comments. I think it's important for Earth to not only share our own traditions, but also to learn how Shaldar art and literature have shaped your society. These shared experiences are what build trust between our peoples. Zyra's gaze met his, and though her expression remained neutral, there was a warmth in her eyes that lingered a moment longer than necessary. Alan kept his own expression steady, aware of Zerion's presence. He couldn't afford to let anything slip. When the session ended, Alan stayed behind, reviewing some notes. He felt Zyra approach before he saw her. Ambassador Cardell, she said softly, her voice carrying a calm certainty. Princess Zyra, he replied, keeping his tone even. Is there something I can help you with? She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. I wanted to thank you. The points you raised today were insightful. I believe our discussions have been fruitful. Alan nodded, standing up. I'm glad to hear that. Earth has a lot to learn from your people, and I'm sure we have much to share in return. Her lips quirked in a faint smile. Indeed, I hope these exchanges can continue. Before Alan could respond, Zerion stepped into the room. His sharp eyes flicked between Alan and Zyra, then settled on the ambassador. Princess, Zerion said, his tone respectful but firm. We should prepare for the evening ceremonies. There's much to discuss. Zyra inclined her head. Of course, Zerion. She turned back to Alan, her voice dropping to a softer note. Until next time, Ambassador. Alan watched her leave, the tension in the room thickening as Zerion's gaze lingered on him. The warrior didn't speak, but his expression said more than words could. Alan held his ground, giving Zerion a polite nod before returning to his notes. Once the room was empty, Alan exhaled deeply. It was becoming harder to maintain the balance, but for now he had managed to keep his composure. If only he knew how much longer he could keep it up. Chapter 7. A Risky Confession. Alan tapped idly at the communicator in his hand, watching the Shaldar skyline glitter under the twin moons. It was late, and most of the city had quieted, leaving only the faint hum of distant machinery and the occasional ripple of alien wind through the crystalline trees. Peter emerged from the adjoining room, carrying a pair of steaming cups. "Still thinking about her?" Peter asked as he handed Alan a cup. Alan took it without a word, then sighed. "It's not like I can just turn off how I feel. She's different." "You don't have to explain that to me," Peter said, sitting on the edge of a low table. "But what's your plan here? It's not exactly a normal situation." "I don't have one," Alan admitted. "I just know I can't keep pretending it's not happening. Every time we talk, every time I see her, it's like she gets me in a way no one else does." Peter raised an eyebrow. "And you're sure it's mutual?" Alan stared into his cup, watching the thin vapor curl upward. "I don't know. Sometimes I think it is. The way she looks at me, the things she says. But then I remind myself of who she is. She has her duties, her obligations. And then there's Zarion." "That's a pretty big obstacle," Peter said. "It's not just about her feelings or yours. It's about politics, culture, the alliance. If you're wrong, if she doesn't feel the same way, you're risking more than just your dignity." Alan looked up at him. "What would you do?" Peter thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Honestly, I don't know. But I'd think long and hard about what I'm willing to lose before I make a move." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. Finally, Peter stood. "Just don't make any rash decisions tonight. Sleep on it. If you're going to say something, make sure it's the right time." The following day, Alan found himself standing on a balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The air was warm, and the scent of alien blossoms drifted on the breeze. He hadn't intended to come here, but his feet seemed to carry him to this spot unbidden. He turned at the sound of light footsteps and saw Zyra approaching. "Ambassador," she greeted him, her voice calm but laced with curiosity. "You're out here early." Alan forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd clear my head." Zyra joined him at the railing, her luminous robes shimmering faintly in the morning light. "It's a peaceful place," she said. "I often come here when my thoughts are troubled." He glanced at her, debating whether to speak. Finally, he decided there was no perfect moment. "Princess, I have to ask you something." She looked at him, her expression open. "What is it?" Alan hesitated, searching for the right words. "Over the past few weeks, we've spent a lot of time together. I feel like I've come to understand you in a way I never expected. And I think you understand me too." Zyra tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "You have a unique perspective, Alan. One I've come to appreciate greatly." "It's more than that," he said, his voice quieter now. "When I'm with you, it feels like none of the other differences matter. I know this isn't something I should say, but I care about you. Not just as an ambassador or a representative of my people, but as a person. And I need to know if you feel the same." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Zyra's gaze didn't waver, but her expression shifted to something softer, more vulnerable. Finally, she spoke. "Alan, what you're saying isn't easy for me to hear. I've been raised to put my people's needs above my own, to fulfill my responsibilities without hesitation." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "But you're right. I do feel something. I've tried to ignore it, to push it away. But every time I see you, every time we talk, I'm reminded that you see me as more than a princess. You see me for who I am." Alan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Zyra, She held up a hand, stopping him. "This doesn't mean there won't be challenges. Zarion will not be pleased, and my family may not understand. But if I were to deny my feelings, I would be lying to myself. And I cannot continue to live a lie." Alan reached out, placing his hand over hers. Her skin was cool to the touch, and her fingers tightened slightly around his. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "Whatever challenges come, we'll face them together." Zyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then we will face them together." Chapter 8. A New Beginning. The hall was alive with activity. Delegates from across the galaxy mingled in the grand chamber, their voices echoing against the high arched ceiling. It was a historic moment, one Alan never could have anticipated when he first arrived in the Shaldar capital. Yet here he stood, surrounded by ambassadors, envoys, and advisors, preparing to announce an unprecedented shift in the alliance between Earth and the Shaldar Dominion. Peter approached, a data slate in hand and a wry grin on his face. "You ready for this? Big moment and all." Alan smirked. "I've had enough practice speeches to last a lifetime. Ready as I'll ever be." Peter clapped him on the shoulder. "Good, because I don't think they've ever seen anything like this before. Could set the tone for the next century." The sound of delicate chimes signaled the start of the formal proceedings. Alan and Peter took their places at the front of the chamber, facing a sea of alien faces. Zyra stood to Alan's left, her usual air of regal composure softened by a calm determination. She met his gaze briefly, and though the exchange lasted only a moment, it steadied his nerves. The Shaldar Grand Arbiter rose, her tall, shimmering form catching the light. "Today," she began, her voice resonant, "we gather not just as allies, but as partners in forging a new understanding. Let it be known that the Shaldar Dominion and the people of Earth are united by a common purpose. A future built on shared knowledge, mutual respect, and a commitment to cultural exchange." Applause followed her words, but Alan noticed it was measured. There were still skeptics, still those who viewed this partnership with caution. He couldn't blame them. What they were attempting was without precedent. When it was his turn, Alan stepped forward. He took a steadying breath before addressing the crowd. "Thank you, Grand Arbiter, and thank you to the Shaldar people for welcoming us here. Earth's journey into the wider galaxy has been both humbling and enlightening. We came as Nuko." In his words settle. "This agreement is more than a document. It's a promise to continue building the bridges we've started here. I am proud to stand beside Princess Zyra and all of you as we take this step forward." As Alan returned to his place, Peter leaned over and whispered, "Nice. Not too long, not too short. Hit the right notes." "Thanks," Alan muttered, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. The ceremony concluded with a symbolic exchange of gifts, artifacts representing each culture's history and values. Zyra presented Alan with an intricately carved crystal that shimmered with an inner light, a piece of her people's most cherished traditions. In return, Alan offered a carefully chosen collection of Earth's literature and music, recordings that would now be preserved in the archives of the Shaldar Dominion. When the formalities ended, the mood in the hall shifted. Delegates moved to smaller groups, discussing what this new alliance would mean for the future. Alan took a moment to step aside, finding a quiet corner where he could catch his breath. Zyra approached, her expression thoughtful. "You spoke well," she said. "I could tell the audience was listening." "Thanks," Alan said. "I wasn't sure how it would go over." "You made them see what I've seen," Zyra said. "That this partnership is more than political. It's personal. It's about people connecting, learning from one another." Alan nodded. "You gave me the courage to push for this. I couldn't have done it without you." They stood there for a moment, the hum of conversation around them fading into the background. Zyra's gaze held his, and he felt a warmth in her presence that reminded him why he had taken this risk in the first place. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. Peter walked over, breaking the quiet moment. "Alan, they're calling for you. Looks like they want to discuss next steps." Alan glanced at Zyra. "Duty calls." She smiled, a subtle but genuine expression. "Go. You have work to do." As Alan followed Peter back into the crowd, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of something new, something that might shape the future for both their worlds.